Commander Lyra Chun stood near the viewport of Nexus Station and watched the endless black of space stretch out before her like a canvas painted with distant stars. She had been stationed here for 6 months now, and the wonder of it had not yet faded. Every morning she woke up and reminded herself that she was one of only a handful of humans living this far from Earth. And that thought still gave her a small thrill of pride. Nexus Station was a marvel of engineering that floated at the intersection of 3 major trade routes and served as a neutral meeting ground for dozens of species from across the galaxy. The station was massive and shaped like a great wheel that slowly rotated to create artificial gravity for its inhabitants. Over 50,000 beings called it home, and they came from worlds that humans had only dreamed about a few centuries ago. Lyra had grown used to walking past creatures with scales and fur and feathers and skin that glowed in strange colors. She had learned to read body language that was nothing like human body language, and she had taught herself to stay calm when beings 3 times her size looked down at her with obvious contempt. Humans were still new to the galactic community. They had only achieved faster than light travel about 200 years ago, and in the grand scale of things that made them infant species. Like the Valkyrie had been traveling between stars for 10,000 years before humans had even invented writing. The Valkyrie considered themselves the true masters of this region of space, and they made sure everyone knew it. They were tall reptilian beings with scales that gleamed like polished copper and eyes that burned with golden fire. Their warriors were legendary throughout the galaxy, and their empire controlled more than 100 star systems. When word came that a Valkyrie diplomatic delegation was arriving at Nexus Station, the entire human contingent had been briefed on what to expect. Do not make direct eye contact for too long, because they see it as a challenge. Do not show your teeth when you smile, because they see it as a threat. Display. Do not under any circumstances touch them first, because physical contact has complex social meanings in there. Culture. Lyra had memorized all of these rules, and she had no intention of breaking them. Her job was simple. She was the security liaison for the human delegation, and her role was to keep their people safe and stay out of trouble. The Valkyrie transport arrived at 0900 station time, and Lyra was there to observe from a respectful distance. The ship was beautiful in a terrifying way. Like a great predatory bird made of dark metal and sharp angles, it docked with a precision that spoke of centuries of spacefaring experience. And then the airlock opened. Ambassador Sethrix was the first to emerge. He was tall even for a Valkyrie, and his scales were darker than the others, with patterns of gold that marked him as nobility. His eyes swept across the welcoming party with barely concealed boredom, and when his gaze passed over the human delegates, he did not even pause. They were beneath his notice. Behind him came his entourage of advisors and servants and guards. Lyra counted 8 guards in total, and they moved with the fluid grace of predators who had never known fear. One of them caught her attention immediately. He was slightly shorter than the ambassador, but more heavily built, with scars visible on his scales and eyes that seemed to calculate the threat level of everything they touched. When those eyes found Lyra, they lingered for just a moment longer than they should have. She held his gaze without flinching, and something flickered across his face that might have been surprise, or might have been irritation. This was Tarvok. She would learn his name later, but in that moment she simply filed him away in her mind as the dangerous one. The welcoming ceremony was formal and tedious. Station Administrator Voss gave a speech about cooperation and mutual benefit and the bright future of interspecies relations. Ambassador Sethrix responded with a speech that said almost nothing, while somehow making clear that he considered this entire exercise to be beneath his dignity. The human ambassador, a skilled diplomat named Catherine Reyes, smiled and nodded and pretended not to notice the insults hidden in every third sentence. Lyra watched it all from her position near the door. She noticed how the Valkyrie guards positioned themselves and how they watched the crowd with professional attention. She noticed how Torvak, in particular, seemed to be studying the human security officers with something that looked almost like amusement. After the ceremony came the reception. This was supposed to be a chance for informal conversation and relationship building, but it quickly became clear that the Valkyrie had no interest in either. They clustered together on one side of the room and spoke among themselves in their own language. While the other delegates tried and failed to engage them, Lyra circulated through the crowd and kept her eyes open and her mouth shut. She paused near a refreshment table to get a drink of water, and that was when she heard the voice behind her. Words were in Valkyrie, and her translator implant converted them automatically. "Look at her," the voice said, and it took Lyra a moment to realize it was talking about Hirsch. She is supposed to be a warrior and a guardian, but she is so small. Lyra did not turn around. "I have heard that humans are weak," a second voice replied, and this one she recognized as Torvak. "They have no claws and no scales, and their bodies break easily, but they breathe like vermin, and they have clever hands that build machines to fight for them." The first voice made a sound that the translator interpreted as contempt. "They send their females to guard them. Perhaps they have no males worth mentioning." Lyra took a sip of her water and kept her expression perfectly neutral. She had heard worse in her time, and she had learned long ago that reacting to insults only gave the person insulting you power over you. But she made sure to remember every word Tarek spoke again, and there was something different in his tone now, something almost curious. "I wonder what would happen if one of these humans was separated from their machines. Would they fight, or would they simply surrender?" First guard laughed. "They would kneel and beg like all weak creatures do when faced with true strength." Lyra finished her water and set down the glass and walked away without looking back. She kept her pace steady and her shoulders relaxed, and she did not give them the satisfaction of seeing that their words had affected her at all, but inside her mind, she was already making plans. She had dealt with bullies before, both human and otherwise. They were all the same in the end. They pushed and pushed until someone pushed back, and then they either learned respect or they learned pain. Lyra had a feeling that before this diplomatic visit was over, Torvak and his friends were going to learn one of those lessons. She just hoped for all their sakes that it would be the first one. 3 days passed, and the tension on the station grew thicker with each one. The Valkyrie delegates made no effort to hide their contempt for the other species around them, and the humans in particular seemed to draw their mockery like magnets drew. Iron Lyra had logged 7 separate incidents of what she carefully described in her reports as cultural misunderstandings. A Valkyrie guard had shouldered past a human engineer in a corridor and sent him sprawling into a wall. Another had made comments about human females that would have started a fight in any bar on Eartha. Third had deliberately knocked a tray of food out of a human server's hands, and then laughed when the young man scrambled to clean up the mess. Each time Lyra had been there to calm things down and to remind her people that they needed to be the bigger species in these situations. Each time she had watched Torvak observing from nearby with that same calculating look in his golden eyes. He was testing them. She realized he was pushing to see how far humans could be pushed before they broke. On the morning of the 4th day, Lyra received orders to escort Dr. Marcus Webb to a trade meeting on the far side of the station. Marcus was a xenobiologist who had been attached to the diplomatic team to provide scientific expertise, and he was one of the kindest people Lyra had ever met. He was also completely hopeless when it came to navigating station politics. That is probably why they assigned me to babysit him, Lyra thought as they set out together through the crowded corridors. Marcus chattered happily about the biological samples he had been studying, and Lyra made appropriate sounds of interest while keeping her attention on their surroundings. The commercial district was busy at this hour with beings from a dozen different species going about their daily business shops, and restaurants and service providers lined the wide corridor, and the air was filled with a mix of languages and smells and sounds that would have overwhelmed Lyra when she first arrived, but now felt almost normal. They were about halfway to their destination when Lyra spotted trouble ahead. Torvak and two other Valkyrie guards were walking toward them, and the corridor was not wide enough for both groups to pass. Without someone stepping aside, Lyra did a quick calculation in her head. There were other beings in the corridor too, and they were all quietly moving to the edges to get out of the way of the approaching Velcarathat. Was what everyone did when the Valkyrie walked through. Everyone got out of their way. Lyra made a decision. She kept walking at the same steady pace, and she positioned herself slightly in front of Marcus as they approached the oncoming group. Torvak saw her and his eyes narrowed. He did not slow down either. The distance between them shrank from 20 meters to 10 to 5 other beings pressed themselves against the walls and watched with the kind of attention that prey animals gave to circling predators. Lyra and Torvak stopped at the same moment with barely a meter of space between them. The two Valkyrie guards flanked their leader, and their hands rested on the weapons at their belts. Marcus had gone very quiet behind her. Torvak looked down at Lyra from his full height, which was nearly 3 feet greater than hers. His boyish scale seemed to darken slightly, which she knew was a sign of aggression in his species. His mandibles clicked together in what her translator interpreted as a sound of contempt. Move aside, little creature. His voice was deep and resonant, and it carried clearly through the now silent corridor. Lyra kept her own voice calm and professional. The right-of-way belongs to those traveling with diplomatic credentials, and we are escorting Dr. Webb to a scheduled meeting. Torvak's golden eyes flicked to Marcus and then back to Lyra. Your meetings mean nothing to me, he said, and there was a hint of something eager in his voice, now as if he was hoping she would give him a reason to escalate this confrontation. Step aside, or I will move you myself. Lyra felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her breathing steady and her expression neutral. She had been in situations like this before, not with aliens, but with humans who thought their size or their strength gave them the right to push others around. The principle was the same. You could not show fear because fear was what they wanted. You could not back down because backing down only invited more aggression. You had to stand your ground and make them understand that you were not prey. I would not recommend that, Lyra said, and her voice came out almost gentle, as if she was offering friendly advice rather than a warning. Something changed in Torvak's expression. Contempt was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just surprise that this tiny human female was not trembling before him. Other Valkyrie guards exchanged glances, and their hands tightened on their weapons. The beings watching from the edges of the corridor seemed to hold their breath. Marcus whispered something that sounded like Lyra. Maybe we should just, but she held up a hand to silence him without taking her eyes off Torvak. The Valkyrie warrior stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Among his people-bearing teeth was a threat display, and his teeth were sharp and numerous. You have spirit, he said, and he almost sounded impressed, but spirit means nothing without strength to back it up, and you are just a soft little human without claws or fangs or scales. He reached out and grabbed Lyra's wrist. Clawed hand closed around her forearm like a vice, and his grip was strong enough to leave bruises among the Valkyrie. This was a gesture of absolute dominance. It was a way of saying, I can do whatever I want to you, and you cannot stop me. It was a gesture that had been used on countless species over thousands of years, and it had always worked. The prey species would freeze in terror. They would submit. They would learn their place. Lyra felt his claws pressing against her skin, and she looked up into his golden eyes, and she saw the certainty there. He was absolutely sure that he had won. He was absolutely sure that she would cower and beg and give him the satisfaction he was looking for. He was wrong. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Lyra had spent her entire adult life learning how to fight. She had started with basic self-defense classes when she was 16 years old, and she had never stopped. She had studied martial arts from a dozen different traditions, and she had learned how the human body worked in ways that most people never thought about. She knew where the nerves ran and where the joints bent and where a small amount of pressure could cause a large amount of pain, but more importantly, she had learned about other species. When humans first made contact with the galactic community, one of the first things they did was study the aliens they encountered. Scientists cataloged their biology and their physiology and their weaknesses. Most of this information was classified and restricted to military and security personnel. Lyra had access to all of it. She knew that the Valkyrie nervous system was different from the human nervous system. Their nerve bundles clustered in different places, and one of those clusters was located just above the elbow joint on the inside of their arm. It was a blind spot in their martial traditions because no species they had ever conquered had known about it until Torvak's clawed hand was still closing around her wrist when Lyra moved. Her free hand shot upward in a motion that looked almost casual. Her fingers found the exact spot above his elbow where the nerve cluster was located. She pressed hard with her thumb and twisted her hand in a very specific way at the same moment. She stepped to the side and pivoted her entire body. She used her hip as a fulcrum, and she used Torvak's own forward lean against him. His arm bent in a direction it was not supposed to go. His body followed because the alternative was having his arm torn from its socket. The pain hit his nervous system like lightning. Nearly 400 pounds of Valkyrie warrior went down. His knees hit the deck with a sound like two rocks slamming together. His free arm scrabbled at the floor trying to find purchase. But Lyra had already locked his other arm behind his back at an angle that sent waves of agony through his entire body. The whole thing had taken less than 2 seconds. The corridor was absolutely silent. The two Valkyrie guards stood frozen in shock, and their hands hovered over their weapons, but they did not draw it. They could not process what they were seeing. Their leader was on his knees, and a human female half his size was holding him there with what appeared to be almost no effort. Lyra's free hand moved to rest on the sidearm at her hip. She did not draw it, but she made sure they saw the motion. Your friend made a mistake, she said, and her voice was still calm and even, as if this was just another normal day on the station. I would hate for you to make the same one. The guards looked at each other and then at Torvak and then back at Lyra. They were not stupid. They could see that if they moved, she could draw her weapon before they reached her. They could see that their leader was completely immobilized and that any attempt to help him might result in serious injury to all of them. They stayed where they were. Torvak snarled something in his native language that her translator could not interpret, but she could guess the meaning from his tone. He tried to move, and she increased the pressure on his arm, just slightly. The snarl turned into a hiss of pain. Stop struggling, Lyra said, and she spoke directly to him now with the kind of patient authority she might use with a misbehaving child. You are making this worse for yourself. I will kill you for this, he managed to say through gritted teeth. His scales had flushed almost black with humiliation and rage, and his golden eyes burned with hatred. No, Lyra said simply, you will not. She let that statement hang in the air for a moment before she continued. I am going to release you now, and when I do, you are going to stand up and step aside and let us pass. She paused. Nod if you understand. The corridor remained silent. Dozens of beings watched from the edges of the crowd, and Lyra could feel their eyes on her. You knew what they were seeing. They were seeing something that should have been impossible. They were seeing a human defeat a Valkyrie warrior in hand-to-hand combat. They were seeing the hunters become the hunted. Torvak did not move for a long moment. His pride was fighting against his pain, and Lyra could almost see the battle happening behind his eyes. But in the end, pain won as it usually did. He nodded. Lyra released him and stepped back in one smooth motion. Her hand stayed on her weapon, and her eyes stayed on the guards as Torvak slowly rose to his feet. His arm hung at his side, and he moved it carefully, as if testing to make sure it still worked. His scales were still dark with fury, but he stepped aside without saying another word. Lyra walked past him. She did not look back, and she did not hurry. She maintained the same steady pace she had been walking before, as if nothing unusual had happened. Marcus fell into step beside her, and she could feel him trembling slightly. Neither of them spoke until they had turned a corner and put 2 corridors between themselves and the Velcarathon. Marcus let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for the past 5 minutes. What in the name of everything holy was that he demanded? That Lyra said calmly was a lesson. She could already feel the adrenaline starting to fade, and her hands were shaking slightly as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had just assaulted a member of a diplomatic delegation from one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. There were going to be consequences, but when she thought about the look on Torvak's face when he hit the deck, she found that she could not bring herself to regret it. Some lessons were worth the cost. The diplomatic incident report landed on Ambassador Sethrix's desk within the hour. Lyra knew this because she was called to a meeting with Station Administrator Voss exactly 47 minutes after the confrontation. In the corridor, she stood at attention in his office while he read through the report with an expression that cycled through disbelief to concern to something that might have been carefully hidden amusement. The Valkyrie are demanding your immediate removal from the station, Voss said finally, and he set down his datapad and looked at her over the top of his folded hands. Ambassador Sethrix called you a violent savage and several other things that my translator could not accurately interpret, but I gathered they were not compliments. I understand, Sir. Lyra replied, and she kept her voice professional and her posture perfect. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences are deemed appropriate. Voss studied her for a long moment. Tell me exactly what happened, he said. Do not leave anything out. So Lyra told him. She described the confrontation in the corridor and the insults and threats from Torvak, explained that she had attempted to defuse the situation through diplomatic means and that she had only acted when Torvak grabbed her. He walked him through the takedown step by step in technical terms that made it sound like a textbook exercise, rather than the terrifying 2 seconds it had actually been. When she finished, Voss was quiet for a while. Then he pulled up the security footage from the corridor and watched it 3 times in a row. The 3rd time through, he actually laughed. It was a short laugh, and he suppressed it quickly, but Lyra saw it. Well, Commander, he said, finally I have reviewed the evidence, and it is clear that the Valkyrie guard initiated physical contact and that you responded with proportionate defensive force. He paused and the corner of his mouth twitched. Very impressive. Proportionate defensive force. I was just doing my job, sir. Of course you were. He leaned back in his chair, and his expression grew more serious. The Valkyrie demand has been rejected by both human and council authorities, and you will remain at your post. But I need you to understand that you have just become the most talked about person on this station. Is that a problem, sir? Not for me, Voss said, but it might be for you. He gestured toward his window, which looked out over the main concourse of the station. By tonight, everyone on Nexus Station will know what happened in that corridor, and by tomorrow, everyone in this sector will know, and within a week, the story will have spread to 100 different worlds. Lyra had expected this, but hearing it out loud still made something tighten in her chest. The Valkyrie will not forget, Voss continued, and they will not forgive. But more importantly, the other species will remember too, and they will start asking questions about humans that they never thought to ask before. What kind of questions? The kind that could change everything. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the crowds moving through the concourse below. We have always presented ourselves as the friendly newcomers, Voss said quietly, and we smile, and we cooperate, and we make ourselves useful, and we never show our teeth. He turned to look at her. You just showed our teeth, Commander, and now everyone knows that the smile is not the only thing we have. Lyra did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Was dismissed her, and she returned to her quarters to find 7 messages waiting for her from various People asking for interviews or statements or explanations. She ignored all of them. That evening, she went to one of the observation lounges to clear her head. Lounge was empty when she arrived, and she stood by the viewport and watched the stars, and tried not to think about how much her life had changed in the span of 2 seconds. She had been standing there for about 20 minutes when she heard footsteps. Behind her, heavy footsteps with the distinctive rhythm of a Valkyrie gate. She turned and found Torvak standing in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Lyra's hand drifted toward her sidearm, but Torvak held up both of his hands with the palms facing. "Harry, I'm not here to fight," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. His scales were no longer flushed with rage, but his eyes still burned with intensity. "I am here to understand how." He stepped further into the lounge and stopped a few meters away from her. His posture was different than before. The arrogance was still there, but it was tempered now by something that looked almost like respect. "We are faster than you," he said, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. "We are stronger, and our reflexes are sharper, and my people have perfected the art of combat for 10,000 years. He paused, and his golden eyes searched her face as if looking for answers written there. "And yet you moved like you knew what I would do before I did it, and you struck a point on my body that I did not even know was vulnerable." He shook his head slowly. "How is this possible?" Lyra considered the question for a long moment. "Your species perfected combat to hunt prey," she said finally, "and you became very good at it because prey animals run and hide and try to escape, and all you had to do was be faster and stronger and more persistent than they were." She turned to face him fully, and she let him see her clearly. "Perhaps for the first time, my species did not evolve to hunt prey," she said, and her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "We evolved to hunt each other." Vivek stared at her. "For 100,000 years, the most dangerous thing on my planet was another human being," Lyra continued, "and we learned to read body language and predict attacks. Because if we did not, then something that looked exactly like us would kill us first." She took a step toward him, and he did not step back, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. "You grabbed my wrist because you expected me to freeze," she said, "and you expected me to submit because that is what prey does when faced with a predator." She smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "But humans are not prey, Torvak. And we never were." You let that sink in before she delivered the final point. "We are the thing that other predators learn to fear." The story spread faster than Lyra had imagined possible. Within a day, the security footage from the corridor had been copied and shared and analyzed by beings on 100 different stations and ships and worlds. Within a week, it had become the most watched video in the sector. Within a month, it had spawned debates and discussions and academic papers about human biology and psychology and martial traditions. The questions came from everywhere. How had a human female overpowered a Valkyrie warrior? How had she known where to strike? How had she moved so fast? Answers led to more questions, and those questions led to a complete reassessment of everything the galactic community thought they knew about humanity. Humans, it turned out, were not the soft and fragile creatures everyone had assumed. Their bodies were capable of remarkable feats of endurance, and their reflexes, while slower than some species, could be trained to operate at speeds that rivaled the fastest predators in the galaxy. Their pain tolerance was legendary once you knew to look for it, and their ability to continue functioning through injury and exhaustion bordered on the impossible. But more disturbing than their physical capabilities was what the Zab psychologists discovered about their minds. Humans were persistent predators who had evolved to chase their prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. They were pack hunters who had developed complex social structures and communication methods specifically designed for coordinated violence. They were tool users who had compensated for their physical limitations by building weapons and machines that multiplied their killing power 1,000-fold, and most disturbing of all, they had spent most of their history fighting each other. The wars of Earth became a subject of intense study across the sector beings who had never heard of Napoleon or Genghis Khan or the two world wars suddenly found themselves reading accounts of conflicts that dwarfed anything in their own histories. The numbers were staggering: millions dead in single battles, millions dead in single centuries. Weapons designed specifically to kill other humans in the most efficient ways possible. The Valkyrie had conquered 100 worlds over 10,000 years, and they had killed perhaps a few million beings in the process. Humans had killed more than that in single decades of fighting each other. Ambassador Sethrix requested a private meeting with the human delegation on the 7th day after the incident. Lyra was not present for the meeting, but she heard about it afterward from Ambassador Reyes. The Valkyrie ambassador had been subdued and thoughtful, and he had asked questions about human history that suggested he had been doing his own research. By the end of the meeting, he had agreed to a new trade agreement that was substantially more favorable to human interests than the original proposal. He had also requested that a human military attaché be assigned to his delegation when they returned home. He wanted someone to teach his warriors what humans knew about combat. The Valkyrie transport was scheduled to depart on the 10th day, and Torvak found Lyra one final time before he left. She was in the same observation lounge where they had talked before, and he approached her with none of the arrogance that had marked their first meeting. "I have served the Empire for 30 years, he said, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard. "I have faced warriors from 100 worlds, and I have killed more enemies than I can count, and I have never been defeated in single combat." He paused, and his translator seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say next. "I have never been surprised. First time." For everything Lyra said. Indeed, he was silent for a moment, and his golden eyes studied her with an intensity that was unsettling, but not threatening. "When my people first encountered humans, we believed you would be easy to dominate," he said finally, "soft bodies and dull claws and weak without your machines." He shook his head slowly, and there was something like wonder in his expression. "We did not understand that your machines were not a replacement for strength," but an expression of it. Lyra did not respond, but she felt something shift in her chest. It was a strange feeling, not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but something in between. "You asked me how I knew where to strike," she said quietly, "and the question deserves a full answer." She turned to face him, and she let him see the truth in her eyes. "Every species we have ever encountered has had weaknesses, and we have found every single one of them." She paused, not because we wanted to conquer you or destroy you, but because we needed to know that we could defend ourselves if we had to. She gestured out at the stars beyond the viewport. "We came from a world where everything wanted to kill us, and then we spent 100,000 years trying to kill each other, and then we looked up at the stars and we wondered what else was out there waiting to kill us." Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind her words. "So we studied and we learned and we prepared, because that is what humans do." Torvak was quiet for a long moment. Then he performed a gesture that her translator identified as a warrior's salute between equals. It was the first time she had ever seen a Valkyrie give such a salute to a humani. "Will not underestimate your kind again, Commander Chun," he said, and his voice carried a new respect that had not been there before. "And I will ensure that others do not make the same error." He turned and walked away, and Lyra watched him go after he left. She stayed at the viewport for a while longer and watched the stars and thought about everything that had changed. The galactic community had spent 200 years treating humans as newcomers and outsiders and minor players in the great game of interstellar politics. They had smiled at the soft little mammals who had managed to build spaceships, and they had patted them on the head and told them to stay out of the way of their betters. But now they knew the truth. Humans had clawed their way to the stars without fangs or scales or natural armor. They had done it with endurance and adaptability and intelligence and a terrifying willingness to fight anything that threatened them. They had done it by being the most dangerous predators on a world full of dangerous predators, and now they were out here among the stars ready to prove themselves all over again. Lyra smiled as she watched the Valkyrie transport undock from the station and begin its journey home. The galaxy was beginning to understand what humanity really was, and she had a feeling this was just the beginning.